Welcome back. I am the Zigzag Man flying solo today from the 420 Studios in Alameda, California. Just put together a terrific slideshow that you're gonna really enjoy. And if you're listening to this, you're already enjoying it. It's about the Milwaukee Braves. Somebody asked me, well, when was it? Tuesday. They said, I was talking to my friend about the old days, the golden age of baseball. And she knew I was a baseball fan. She knew I was a Giant fan in particular. And asked me what happened when the Giants left, and I was 10 years old at the time. She says, what did you do for a team? Who did you root for? And I had no hesitation in telling her. I mean, right off the bat, you'd think, well, a little boy loses his team after 5 years of being a baseball fan. He's 10 years old. I used to go to games with my grandfather at age 5 watching the New York Giants before and after they brought up Willie Mays in the 1951 season. I loved the Giants. But in September of 1957, I'm not even 11 years old, a final decision is reached. And the Giants were definitely moving. And I remember on the last game of the season in 1957, remember this vividly, and I think on a Giant show, a New York Giant show I did, I think I put a picture on the slideshow of this poster that somebody had made and put up in left field, left field, right by the left center field, right by where the Giants walked up to the clubhouse for the final time in this case. And it said, "Stay, team, stay." And I saw that. I said, well, maybe they'll stay. Yeah, I'm 10 years old, for crying out loud. Maybe they'll stay. But no, they don't. And it was official. It became official in September that they were gone. Well, life goes on in a way, even for a broken-hearted 10-year-old. There was a National League pennant race, and the Braves won it. And the one thing my grandfather instilled in me as a fan, there's a big difference between the National League and the American League. And he said his train of thought was that the reason the Yankees were so incredibly successful in the 50s, late 40s, 50s, 60s, always been successful. Point being, the level of competition in the American League was much lesser. So they won more. And his thinking was that there were fewer blacks that crossed the line in the American League. Larry Doby notwithstanding, he was the second black to play in the major leagues. He was brought in by Bill Veeck. But there were fewer blacks and Latins, Minnie Minoso notwithstanding, a great Cuban player, in the American League than there were in the National League. By the mid-50s, early 60s, the vast majority of superstars in the National League were blacks. The really good hitters, the solid ball players, were blacks. Now, the utility guys were mostly white, because this is how it worked. You could be in the major leagues into all these years, and this is way past Jackie Robinson, if you were a star, if you were a starter, if you were a contributor, if you were a good pitcher, great pitcher. But you're not going to sit on anybody's bench and take a job from a white guy well into the 60s. Okay? playing Major League Ball. So his contention was that the American League had weaker overall talent. The Yankees won more, as is proven by the record, you might say, of the National League against the American League when the All-Star games meant something, because there was no other than the World Series. There was no other competition between the two leagues. And Major League Baseball took the division of the National League and the American League very seriously in their rules and in everything else, much less than it is today. It's only National and American League by name only, given that teams go back and forth now. Milwaukee Brewers, Houston Astros, who should have been the Colt 45s forever. And that's just the way I remember them coming back into baseball in '62. But I digress because I'm a rambling old guy. Let's talk about the Milwaukee Braves. They win the pennant in 1957, and my grandfather takes me to the World Series because it's played in... No, he doesn't take me to the World Series. We listened to the World Series. I don't know where I got. He took me to the World Series. We listened to the World Series on the radio. Gillette did a broadcast of the World Series. And it was the Yankees and the Milwaukee Braves. And I was a National League guy because the Giants were a National League team. And no matter what, you got to root for the National League. I rooted for the Braves against the Yankees. And they won that World Series. And some of the players from that team carried over to the next year, most of them as a matter of fact, when the Giants were gone and I couldn't root for the Yankees, and I had no choice but to root for the Braves. And what a pleasure it was. But in '57, they won the World Series. In '58, they played the Yankees again in the World Series. They didn't win. But it is my contention that the 1958 Braves were the second best team to the 1953 Brooklyn Dodgers of any National League team in the era, in the decade. Okay? I know the Giants were just never a great team like the Dodgers were, like the Braves were, like the Yankees were. I was a Giant fan nevertheless. So, on one level, finally, a really strong team to follow, because the Giants have been going downhill since they won in '54, and with a team made up of players that you wouldn't expect to win the World Championship against the Cleveland Indians, who had arguably the best pitching staff in baseball, had won 112 games, beat the Yankees out by like 10 games in a year that the Yankees won more games than they had ever won and it was the last year of their dynasty. They won from 59 to 53. They were world champions. In 54, they won more games than they had ever won, and the Indians beat them out. They were a great team. They were great for many years, as were the Dodgers. Giants, not so much so. So as a kid, 11 now, I'm following the Braves and digging it. And as the slideshow, you're watching the slideshow, what great memories. First of all, and even before Henry Aaron, it was Warren Spahn, because Aaron at that time, in the 50s, played second fiddle to Mays in terms of getting certainly New York press. I mean, he was out in Milwaukee. Played a position that wasn't center field, played right field primarily, although he played a little bit when they took Bruton out, because he was a left-handed hitter who could not hit left-handed pitching, I remember. And they platooned a little bit with Andy Pafko in those days. coming in to play left field when Covington came out, especially for defense. But Covington was another left-handed hitting slugger who really had a hard time against left-handers. And one of the reasons I think that the Braves were as good as they were is because they were as deep as any team imaginable. One of the things my grandfather told me was that over the course of a year, you're always going to need, as he wouldn't even say utility infielder, utility, he'd say you're going to need utility. And the Dodgers had it. Junior Gilliam could play anywhere. The Giants had it. The Yankees had it with Gil McDougald. Here, I'll do a little red barber. This is Gil McDougald coming up, number 12. Number 12 on your scorecard. And as you know, McDougald is one of Casey's favorites. That's what he said, Casey's favorites. Anyway, good memories of Red Barber. We got good announcers today, but had some some great ones. Vin Scully came up under Red Barber doing the Dodgers initially. And when Ricky left the Dodgers, O'Malley couldn't get along with Red Barber, and Red Barber ended up leaving and became a Yankee announcer, part-time Yankee announcer. So, I mean, he wasn't Mel Allen, who's the number one guy, but he was in there. He and Phil Rizzuto made up the team of Yankee announcers in the late 50s. Three great, personable guys, voices and guys that become friends. Your announcers become friends. One thing about technology the way it was, I have no idea who did Milwaukee, who did their games, and never really have had access to their to tapes or anything, or the curiosity who was announcing these guys. And consequently, I was a fan of guys like Harry Hanebrick with the Braves. But all my life, I'm thinking this guy's name pronounces his name Hanebrick. So small little things in life. So years later, it's the 80s. I was fortunate enough to have a job as the West Coast representative for Topps Baseball Card Company. I would go around to the minor leagues and sign players to their contracts so that their baseball card contracts, they'd reach the majors, we'd have their permission to use their picture on baseball cards. Well, I'm in Bakersfield, California, and there's a big guy, big old white-haired guy, distinguished-looking guy. I don't know who he is, but I'm sitting and watching Bakersfield warm up to play some team. In the California League, and I'm just sitting there waiting for my time, and guy gets closer and closer, and I go, whoa, that guy looks very familiar. He's Del Crandall. Del Crandall was a roving catching instructor with the Dodgers in the 80s. So I mean, and he had also played his last year, Crandall had, with the Giants. And I'd been living out in California all this time, and I think it was 65 his last year. He was a backup catcher with the Giants at the end of his career. So I had something to talk to him about. The Braves, the Giants, baseball in general. What do we talk about? Harry Hanebrick. He taught me how to pronounce the name. He looked at me, Hanebrick? No, it's Hanebrick. Because I asked about all these guys and what their value was. Hanebrick was a hustler, according to Del Crandall. This guy just reminded, when we talked about it, he was like Rod Keneal. Very little talent, but kind of could play all over the place. Not well, but hustled and tried a lot. And Crandall, who was probably, next to Campanella, and when Campy was tragically injured, the best catcher in the National League all those many years. Coming from him, it it really meant a lot what he was saying, because he was talking about how the team itself, with Johnny Logan at shortstop and Shane Dinks, and they were all just a bunch of old school team players. And we reminisced, and I enjoyed his company. He was, it was one of the best days I ever spent doing that Topps baseball gig, which I did for like 13 years in the 80s and 90s. That was one of the best days that I remember. Del Crandall. And not talking about how deep that team was. Backed up by Del Rice, who had been a St. Louis Cardinal catcher for a number of years, starter. Carl Sawaski backed him up. Sawaski was a Philadelphia slugger in the early 50s. Very deep team. And besides, I had a guy named Bob Taylor coming up, who would later become a Met, if I'm not mistaken, and he was one of those guys like Felix Mantilla who wasn't getting to play and start and play enough. And sure enough, when the National League expanded a few years later, the Mets got Mantilla, who was a terrific utility infielder for the Braves. And what they did was let him play every day, and he got to, as my grandfather would have said, he exposed himself. He exposed himself. Play too much, you expose yourself. Anyway, who else stands to mind? Of course, Henry Aaron, and Eddie Matthews. They'd be on a show called Home Run Derby in the wintertime. And Home Run Derby was filmed at Wrigley Field. But not Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field in L.A. It was a minor league team. I think the Angels had the Hollywood Angels, or whatever they were called in those days in the Pacific Coast League, were owned by Wrigley, who owned the Cubs. And he named the field out there Wrigley Field. So there was a small little ballpark in L.A., and the producers of the show would bring in all the superstars in the National and the American League. I mean, they had everybody. Mantle, Aaron Matthews, of course, Killebrew. I remember Bob Allison would come, and they'd wear they'd wear the Major League uniform, and it would be a contest, like akin to the Home Run Derby before the All-Star Game, which manages to screw up my best player in my fantasy league, who participates in that thing for the second half of the year. Messes up your stroke just going for a home run. So if I were a general manager in the majors and my player was in the All-Star team and wanted to be in the Home Run Derby, I would say no to that. We'll give you what they would give you as a bonus not to be in it. That's just an aside. So, Wes Covington, solid hitter with the Braves. My mind goes back to the Braves. Solid hitter with the Braves, who later in his career played in Philadelphia. And he was very famous for a quote that once. He said he hit a single, and the team just needed a single. And he swung just as hard at the single as he did for a home run. And I said, you got a single. They interviewed him. You did get a base hit, but you weren't going for the single, were you? And I remember he says, no, always go for the downs. That's how I remember Wes Covington. Always go for the downs. Always go for the downs in life. I say that as a memo to myself and as a memo to my kid and anybody out there who's listening, how baseball is so much like real life. And it's just there's so many analogies that you can get from it. But you got to be solid up the middle. And think about this. In the major leagues, it's an old adage. Listen to this double play combination of Johnny Logan, a young Johnny Logan at the time, right in his prime, and a grizzled veteran, Red Schoendienst, who got to come out a lot because Mantilla was coming up as a utility infielder, so he was always well rested. That's the double play combination. The aforementioned Crandall, Ketchen, and Billy Bruton, I called him jokingly. It's Billy Bruton. Went on to play with Detroit later on in his career. Played about half his career in Milwaukee, half his career in Detroit. I just don't think Billy Bruton would have done well in Atlanta. I don't know. But he bailed, went to Detroit for one reason or another, and had a good career in Detroit. I've always liked the Tigers as a result of Billy Bruton being in center field for the 60s. They won with him, if I'm not mistaken, in 68, with him in center field. So Billy Bruton had a nice career, albeit kind of a weak arm. And there you have it. Matthews, what can you say about Eddie Matthews? What could you say about Aaron that hasn't been said? These were superstar Hall of Famers. Spahn was incredible. As getting back to their pitching, which was very, very deep. They had a kid named Juan Pizarro coming up. They had naturally Spahn and Burdette. Gene Conley, who was a historian in himself. Gene Conley was Bill Russell's backup at center for the Boston Celtics. And he was a pitcher for the Braves. And there was only one other guy that I could think of that had that sort of notoriety in one sport or the other, and that is Dave DeBusschere, who was a pitcher in the White Sox organization, played in the majors a little bit, and was a 26-year-old coach in the NBA with the Detroit Pistons. And a big part of why the New York Knicks went on to win championships in the late 60s and early 70s is because they got to acquire Dave DeBusschere for one of my favorite players in basketball, Howie Comas, your New York Knickerbockers. That's the way it is when a man babbles. I think we've covered most of the Braves. Saliva Lou Burdette was their second-best pitcher and a Yankee killer in the World Series. Won 3 games, most valuable player. Accused of throwing a spitball all those years, whether he did or not. He never denied it. He liked it, that it was in the batter's head, that at any time the spitball could be coming. Interesting, I was reading something about the spitball, off the subject a little bit. When they first illegalized the spitball, they grandfathered it in that if you were a pitcher in already using the spitball, you could continue to use the spitball. It's just the new pitchers that couldn't use the spitball. Very weird how baseball is and how self-righteous they are on so many different levels. That'll be for another day. Only thing I want to leave you with about the Braves is they had Joey J, who was the first player in the majors to have come out of the Little League program. Did I stutter on that a little bit? The Little League program. That's better. Incredible to a kid growing up. It gives you something to think about. If that guy can do it, maybe I could do it. Strange, huh? Baseball gives you little stuff like that. Prepares one for the real life. So, do me this, everybody. Take 2 and hit one to right field. And if you can't do that, keep your humor dry, keep your dreams wet, keep your kids off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. It's never a good idea, despite what you've heard, despite what Uncle Billy tells you. Doesn't help. Do that for me. And most importantly, second most importantly, keep your kid out of recruiting stations. military recruiting stations. They will lie to your child, use said child as fodder for imperialistic wars, and it's always the rich that are sending the poor people's children off to do that. So the best way to stop war is just simply don't contribute. Be the first one on your block to have your kid not come home in a box. A little paraphrasing of Country Joe McDonald. All right, and most importantly, keep on keeping on.